Part 1: The Price of a Beating Heart. A wall between life and death. The hospital corridors were eerily silent, but my husband, Nestor, paced back and forth outside the operating room. His fingers drummed anxiously against his phone, his brows furrowed, his entire being consumed by worry. Behind that wall, on the other side of those double doors, lay Pamela, the woman he had loved long before I ever entered his life. And me? I was right there too, but in a way neither of them could have imagined. When the doors finally swung open, Pamela was wheeled out, her skin pale, her breathing shallow. Her eyes fluttered open weakly, and the first words out of her lips weren't of gratitude for her survival, nor relief for seeing her beloved Nestor. Instead, she rasped, "Where is Sister Cy? Why didn't she come with you?" At the mention of my name, a flicker of irritation passed over Nestor's face. His voice was clipped, dismissive. "Don't worry about her. She's perfectly fine." But he didn't know. He had no idea that Pamela's new heart was mine. A life that ended too soon. In the cold, sterile room, a nurse pulled a white sheet over my lifeless body, her voice solemn as she announced the time of death. The air smelled of antiseptic, yet a lingering chill clung to the space. My body had ceased to exist in this world. And yet, I was still here. Hovering. Watching. Existing in some cruel limbo between life and death. I could see everything. The doctors bustling around, cleanin'. G up after the surgery. The way Pamela's heart monitor beeped steadily, proving that the transplant had been successful. The relief in the eyes of the medical staff. They had saved a life tonight. But at what cost? As I floated in the air, I found myself inexplicably drawn to her. Pamela. My heart, now hers, was keeping her alive. The man who never chose me. Outside, Nestor was still pacing, his expression unreadable. When he saw the doctor emerge, he stepped forward hastily, his voice laced with concern. "How is she?" The doctor nodded reassuringly. The surgery was a success, thanks to the timely heart donation. Nestor's shoulders sagged slightly in relief. "Do you know who the donor is?" "I'd like to thank their family." The doctor hesitated before shaking his head. "I'm sorry, Mr. Joe." The donor requested anonymity. I could only imagine what Nestor would have done if he knew the truth. If he knew it was my heart now beating in Pamela's chest. Would he be grateful that his beloved Pamela was alive? Or would he mourn me, even for a moment? Somehow, I already knew the answer. A deep ache settled within me, even in death. How could I still feel this pain? It was a cruel joke, one last twist of the knife before the universe let me go. As my covered body was wheeled past him, something strange happened. Nestor stopped pacing. He turned sharply, his eyes narrowing as he looked over his shoulder, as if sensing something, someone. For a fleeting moment, he seemed dazed, as though something inside him told him to look again. But then, just as quickly, he dismissed the thought and turned back toward Pamela's room, disappearing inside without another glance. And I, a mere specter of the woman I once was, floated after him. The woman he truly loved. Pamela was still unconscious, her face ghostly pale, her lips dry. Nestor sat beside her, his hand encasing hers as if his touch alone could tether her to this world. I lingered in. Watching their intimate moment, feeling like an intruder in my own story. I had once called myself his wife. I had once thought I could earn his love. But there had always been 3 people in our marriage. And I had never been the one he chose. A sudden memory surfaced. Pamela, eyes burning with resentment, had once spat the words at me. If it weren't for your scheming, I should have been the one to marry brother Nestor. And Nestor himself, his voice as cold as ice, had once told me, Sabrina, you should know why I married you. Yes. I knew. I had always known. I was the third wheel in their story. The obstacle standing in their way. And now? Now I was finally gone. And they could be happy. A love that was never mine. Nestor leaned closer to Pamela, resting his forehead against the back of her hand. His eyes, filled with an emotion I had never been able to reach, stayed locked on her face. I wanted to turn away, but I couldn't. I was trapped in this moment, forced to witness the love I had never been worthy of. How much time passed, I wasn't sure. But eventually, Pamela stirred. Her fingers twitched, her breathing quickened, and then her eyes fluttered open. Brother Nestor, her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. At the sound, Nestor's body stiffened. His grip on her hand tightened, and when their eyes met, something in him shattered. He pressed the call button immediately, summoning G the doctor, but his attention never wavered from her. I thought I would never see you again, Pamela choked out, tears slipping down her pale cheeks. Nestor's lips parted, but no words came. Instead, his free hand reached up, brushing her tears away with a tenderness that left a bitter taste in my non-existent throat. No. Everything will be fine now, he finally murmured. You'll recover. I promise. A sharp pang of resentment clawed at me. Everything would be fine for them. But what about me? The name that still haunts them. After the doctor's examination, Pamela was deemed stable enough to remain in the hospital for observation. Once they were alone again, she hesitated before speaking. Her voice was quiet, hesitant. Where is Sister Sai? Why didn't she come with you? For a second, the air between them tensed. I stiffened, waiting, watching. Nestor's jaw clenched. His shoulders went rigid. And then, in a voice tinged with something dangerously close to disgust, he muttered, Don't worry about her. Pamela blinked, then lowered her gaze. But I caught it, the faintest flicker of a smile curling at the corner of her lips. She knew. She had always known how to play him. How to say my name just to test his reaction. And he fell for it. Every single time. As I drifted away from their intimate moment, a cold realization settled within me. Pamela wasn't just the love of Nestor's life. She was also the one who had taken mine. And I would find out how. No matter what. Part 2, Whispers from the Dead. A love I could never keep. Nestor held Pamela's hand tightly, his forehead resting against the back of it. The room was dimly lit, the hospital's fluorescent lights casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The rhythmic beeping of the heart-mon. Either was a reminder that my heart, my own heart, was still beating inside Pamela's chest. I stood there, invisible, weightless, watching the scene unfold before me. Pamela's fingers twitched slightly, and then, her eyes fluttered open. Her voice was weak and raspy, yet the first words she spoke carried an unbearable weight. Brother Nestor. Nestor's entire body tensed. His breath hitched, his fingers curled around hers as if he had been holding himself together just for this moment. He had been waiting for her to wake up. Not for me. Never for me. Pamela's lips trembled. I thought I would never see you again. Tears slid down her cheeks, making her look small, fragile, pitiful. Nestor's face softened, his gaze filled with something I had never seen when he looked at me. You'll be fine now, he whispered. Everything is going to be okay. Everything was fine. For them. But what about me? The surge of resentment clawed at my insides like fire, a feeling I shouldn't even have anymore. I was dead. I wasn't supposed to feel. And yet, watching them made something inside me burn. Pamela shifted slightly, her eyes flickering to Nestor's face. A hesitant expression crossed her features before she spoke again. "Where is Sister Sai?" she asked softly. "Why didn't she come with you?" I stiffened. Nestor's entire body seemed to freeze at the mention of my name. Then, his face darkened, his jaw tightening as he lowered his gaze. "Don't worry about her," he muttered, his voice clipped. Pamela's lips parted slightly in surprise. Then, after a moment, she nodded. But I saw it, the subtle curl at the edge of her lips. A tiny, barely there smirk. She knew. She had always known how to say my name in front of him, how to play her role perfectly. And Nestor, as always, fell for it. My fingers curled in to fists, though there was nothing for me to clench. I didn't exist in the physical world anymore. But I could still feel the weight of betrayal, the suffocating pain of being discarded so easily. They could forget me. But I would never forget them. A ghost at their bedside. Pamela spent the next hour talking to Nestor in her soft, sweet voice, acting fragile, weak. Every now and then, she'd reach for his hand, clutching it desperately like a lost child. And he let her. He indulged her in ways he had never indulged me. I had been his wife, yet he had never held me like this. Never looked at me with such devotion. I stood there, a silent witness to their love, trapped between bitterness and sorrow. Eventually, Nestor checked his watch and sighed. "I should go home," he said, hesitating slightly. Pamela's grip on his hand tightened. "Brother Nesto. I don't want to be alone." Her voice was small, almost trembling. I already knew what would happen next. She always did this. Always clung to him. And as expected, Nestor's hesitation lasted only a moment before he pulled out his phone. "I'll ask Aunt Wong to come stay with you." Pamela's lower lip quivered. "Can't you stay with me?" I knew that voice. That soft, pleading tone. That always made him give in. And just like that, Nestor sighed and nodded. "All right," he murmured. "I'll stay." Of course. I felt the familiar pang of being pushed aside once again. But then something unexpected happened. Nestor picked up his phone and opened our last chat. Our conversation had stopped 2 days ago. The last message was from me. "Let's get a divorce." He had replied. "Don't make trouble out of nothing." I stared at the screen, my translucent form flickering slightly. Why was he looking at that now? His lips pressed together tightly, and after a brief hesitation, he typed another message. "I won't be coming home tonight." I scoffed bitterly. I already knew. But I couldn't reply to you anymore, Nestor. I was gone. Pamela, who had been watching him, smiled faintly. She knew she had won. I turned away, unable to watch them any longer. Secrets hidden in the dark. Nestor got up to fetch some water, leaving Pamela alone for a moment. And that's when she pulled out her phone. I floated behind her, my curiosity piqued. Pamela's hands moved quickly, opening her secondary WeChat account. She typed a message to someone whose profile picture was entirely black. "Is everything handled?" The reply came almost instantly. "Don't worry. Everything is taken care of." A cold gleam flickered in Pamela's eyes. Dying and giving me her heart, at least she died for a good cause. My entire being froze. She knew. Not only did she know I was dead, she had been involved in it. Rage exploded inside me like an uncontrollable wildfire. I turned to look at my own semi-transparent reflection in the window. Was this why I was still here? Because my story hadn't ended yet? Because I still had unfinished business? I clenched my fists, hatred surging through my being. Pamela. She had stolen my husband. She had stolen my child. And now she had stolen my heart, literally. And worst of all, she had planned it. She had planned my death. But I wouldn't let her get away with it. I might be dead. But I wasn't gone. Not yet. A phone call that changed everything. Nestor returned with a thermos of warm water, but his eyes kept drifting toward his phone. Something was bothering him. When his phone suddenly rang, he nearly dropped the thermos. Hello? His voice was tense. Sigh? Yes, I won't be coming home tonight. There was a pause. What? She hasn't come back either? His expression changed, his grip on the phone tightening. I understand. He hung up, his face clouded with something unreadable. Pamela noticed and quickly took his hand, wrapping it in a tissue. What's wrong? She asked sweetly. Nestor hesitated. Then, he shook his head. Something came up at the company, he lied. I need to go. I narrowed my eyes. He was lying. Pamela didn't seem to notice. She simply nodded and smiled. All right. Go ahead then. Nestor picked up his suit jacket and walked to the door. Before leaving. Gee, he glanced back at Pamela one last time. Rest well, he said. I'll see you tomorrow. But I could tell, his mind was somewhere else. Something had unsettled him. And I intended to find out what. A truth that couldn't stay buried. Nestor drove home in silence, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His jaw was clenched, his eyes dark. Whenever he stopped at a red light, he checked his phone. Still no reply from me. Still no sign of where I had gone. I floated beside him, watching. Gee, his every move. What was he thinking? Did he regret something? Or was this just another game he was playing in his mind? As we neared our house, Nestor sighed heavily and typed another message. Where did you go? I stared at the words on the screen, an unbearable ache settling inside me. I could almost laugh at the irony. Now he wanted to find me. But it was too late. Too late for everything. As we entered the house, Aunt Wong greeted him. Sir, Madam hasn't returned yet. Nestor's face darkened. When? Did she leave? Around 8 in the morning, Aunt Wong recalled. She got a call and then went out. Nestor's eyes sharpened. A call. Something clicked in his mind. And in that moment, I knew. He was about to uncover the truth. Part 3, The Haunting Truth. A trail of lies. Nestor stood frozen in the dimly lit hallway of our house. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room. His fingers tightened around his phone, his brows furrowed in deep thought. Sai left at 8 in the morning, he repeated, more to himself than to Aunt Wong. Yes, sir, the elderly housekeeper confirmed, wringing her hands. She got a phone call, then left in a hurry. A call? Nestor's voice sharpened, a sudden edge of urgency creeping in. Yes, but I didn't hear who it was from, Aunt Wong admitted. She seemed anxious, though. Nestor's eyes darkened. His wife, me, had disappeared. And now, for the first time, he was beginning to suspect something was wrong. If on ly he had realized sooner. I watched him, unseen, as his expression shifted from confusion to something closer to unease. He turned and walked upstairs to our bedroom, pushing the door open with a heavy sigh. Everything was the same. My clothes were still in the closet. My suitcase was untouched. There were no signs of me packing up and leaving voluntarily. And then his eyes landed on my desk. The papers. Nestor strode forward, reaching down with trembling hands. He picked them up, scanning. The contents. His entire body tensed. It was my divorce papers. Already signed. A storm of emotions flickered across his face: shock, disbelief, and something deeper. Pain? He exhaled sharply and dropped onto the chair, running a hand over his face. Then, for the second time that night, he opened his phone and typed another message. Stop being stubborn. Come back when you're done causing trouble. I laughed bitterly. Was that what he thought? That I had simply left to cause trouble? I had left forever. And soon, he would find out. A ghost that wouldn't stay silent. The next morning, Nestor left early for the hospital, carrying a tray of carefully prepared meals. He was going to see Pamela. I drifted along beside him, watching his every move, every flicker of emotion on his face. As he stepped into Pamela's hospital room, her eyes lit up instantly. Brother Nestor, she whispered, reaching out for his hand. I brought your favorite dishes, he said gently, placing the tray down. He didn't notice the way my presence made the air feel heavy, the way the lights in the room flickered slightly as I hovered nearby. Pamela smiled sweetly, her gaze lingering on him. Watching them made me sick. If I had still been alive, I might have turned away. But I had nowhere else to go. I had no choice but to watch. Pamela reached for his hand again, tilting her head innocently. Brother Nestor. I feel so much better now. My heart is strong again. She said it with a certain pride in her voice, as if she knew exactly whose heart was beating inside her chest. Nestor, unaware of her true meaning, simply nodded. That's good. She hesitated for a moment before asking, did Sister Sai ever come back? His hand stiffened slightly in hers. No, he admitted. Pamela's lips pursed in a small frown. That's strange. She didn't tell you where she went? Nestor shook his head, and for the first time, a flicker of frustration passed through his eyes. I don't know where she is. Pamela lowered her gaze, but I caught it, the tiny, barely there smirk on her lips. She was enjoying this. Enjoying the fact that I was gone. But she didn't know. I wasn't gone. I wasn't leaving until I made her pay. A call that changed everything. Later that day, Nestor left the hospital and went straight to the office. As soon as he entered the building, he walked past the receptionist, barely glancing her way. But just as he passed, she suddenly called out. Mr. Joe? He stopped in his tracks and turned. What is it? The receptionist hesitated, as if unsure whether she should speak. But then she said, your wife called yesterday morning. Nestor's entire body stiffened. What? She called the office. She said she couldn't reach you and asked if you had come in yet. His heart pounded. He had never received that call. He quickly checked his phone history, but there was nothing. His mind raced. Yesterday morning, he had been at the hospital with Pamela. Pamela had taken his phone at one point, claiming she wanted to play a game. His grip tightened around his phone. Had she deleted the call? Had she known? His throat went dry as he turned back to the receptionist. Did she say anything else? The woman shook her head. No, just that she was looking for you. Nestor's hands curled into fists. Something wasn't right. Something was very, very wrong. A search for the truth. That evening, Nestor did something he hadn't ever done before. He called a private investigator. I need to find out where my wife went, he said, his voice steady but firm. She hasn't contacted anyone. No one has seen her. The investigator agreed to start immediately. But Nestor couldn't shake the feeling of unease that gripped his chest. For the rest of the night, he barely slept. And neither did I. I stood by the window of our bedroom, watching him toss and turn in bed, his face lined with frustration. For the first time since seeing my death, he looked like he cared. But it was too late. He had ignored me when I was alive. Now that I was gone, his regret meant nothing. A lead that shocked him. The next day, the private investigator called him with the first lead. There are no records of your wife leaving the city, the man reported. No plane tickets, no train tickets. Nestor's frown deepened. Then where did she go? The last time she was seen was on surveillance, getting into a taxi near your home. Nestor stiffened. What time? Around 8 in the morn. ING. The exact time Aunt Wong had mentioned. Nestor's hands trembled slightly as he gripped his phone. Where did the taxi drop her off? Near Jenna Road. Jenna Road. Nestor's blood ran cold. That area was remote, far from the city. Why would Cy go there? His heart pounded wildly as the investigator continued. The taxi driver said she got out of the car and walked alone toward the empty roads. He didn't see where she went after that. A wave of dread crashed over Nestor. Something. G was very, very wrong. And then, the investigator said the one thing that made his stomach drop. We checked her phone records. Nestor's breath caught. Who called her that morning? A long pause. Then, the last call she received was from Pamela. The words hit him like a sledgehammer. His ears rang. His mind went blank. Pamela. Pamela had called Cy before she disappeared. Everything falls apart. The phone nearly slipped from Nestor's grasp. He barely heard the investigator's voice. Mr. Joe? He swallowed hard. Are you sure? Yes. Nestor's pulse roared in his ears. Pamela. Pamela had called Cy the morning she went missing. Had she lured her out? Had she planned something? His heart pounded, his thoughts racing. And then, a darker, more horrifying thought crept into his mind. Had Pamela hurt her? The next thing he knew, he was running. Out of his office. Into his car. He sped down the road, his tires screeching as he raced toward the hospital. He needed answers. Now. I floated beside him, watching the horror dawn in his eyes. Finally. He was beginning to understand. And he was about to uncover the truth. Part 4, The Lies That Breathe. A race against the truth. Nestor's fingers gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The streets blurred past him as he sped toward the hospital, his pulse hammering in his ears. Pamela. Pamela had been the last person to call Cy before she disappeared. The thought made his stomach twist violently. For the first time in his life, an unsettling realization crawled into his mind, one he had refused to acknowledge before. Had he trusted the wrong person all along? His mind reeled as he replayed every moment, every glance, every calculated move Pamela had ever made. And then, for the first time, he doubted her. But it was too late. Because I was already gone. Pamela's games. When Nestor burst into Pamela's hospital room, she was sitting up in bed, her long hair cascading over her shoulders, a soft, practiced smile on her lips. "Brother Nesto," she greeted sweetly, but her expression faltered slightly at the look on his face. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling with barely contained anger. "Where is Sai?" His voice was low, controlled, but there was an underlying storm brewing beneath it. Pamela blinked. "Sister Sai?" Nestor took a step forward, his dark eyes boring into hers. "You called her the morning she disappeared." The air in the room thickened. For the first time, Pamela looked nervous. Her fingers curled into the sheets, but she quickly masked her unease with a soft laugh. "Oh, that?" "Yes, I called her," she admitted smoothly. "I was worried about you. I asked her to check on you, but she didn't answer." A lie. A terrible lie. Nestor didn't even blink. His fists clenched at his sides. "Then why didn't you tell me?" Pamela tilted her head, a delicate frown crossing her face. I didn't think it was important." Nestor's lips parted slightly, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. His patience snapped. "Stop lying to me." Pamela's eyes widened, genuine shock flashing through them. "I know you spoke to her," he gritted out, his voice shaking with barely suppressed fury. "And I know she disappeared right after that." Pamela swallowed hard, her grip tightening on the blanket. "Nestor, His voice cut through the room like a blade. "What did you do to her?" Pamela flinched as if she had been slapped. A thick silence stretched between them. And then, for the first time, her mask cracked. A slow, cold smile spread across her lips. And my translucent form trembled as I watched her true face finally emerge. "Confessions of a murderer." "You're getting so worked up over your wife," Pamela murmured, tilting her head. "That's new." Nestor's jaw tightened. Pamela exhaled dramatically, then leaned back against her pillows, her fingers tracing the edge of her hospital bracelet. "You want to know where she went?" she asked lightly. Nestor's fists clenched. "I already know." Pamela's smile flickered slightly. "Oh?" Nestor took a step forward, his voice sharp and cutting. "She went to Jenna Road." Something in Pamela's expression shifted, just for a second. But it was enough. Nestor saw it. My heart, my stolen heart, lurched in her chest. His voice dropped to a deadly whisper. "She never came back." Pamela's fingers twitched against the sheets. "You planned it, didn't you?" Nestor accused. Pamela's lips parted, a shaky breath escaping. "And then?" She laughed. A soft, eerie, twisted laugh. The sound made my ghostly form shudder. "Nestor," she said sweetly, her voice dripping with mockery. "Why are you so upset? You hated her." His entire body went rigid. Pamela leaned forward slightly, her eyes gleaming with something dark and dangerous. "You never loved her," she whispered. "Not like you loved me." Nestor didn't move. Pamela let the silence settle before tilting her head again. "You married her because you had no choice," she murmured. "She tricked you. She forced her way into your life. She stole our future." The venom in her voice was unmistakable now. And for the first time, Nestor saw her for who she really was. Pamela exhaled softly. And now? She placed a delicate hand over her chest, where my heart beat steadily beneath her ribs. She finally did something right. Nestor's breath caught. Pamela smiled sweetly. She gave me her heart. The room froze. And Nestor, who had always been blind to the truth, I saw everything. The breaking point. The world around me seemed to collapse as I watched Nestor's face drain of color. His lips parted slightly, his breathing unsteady. He wasn't just horrified. He was terrified. What did you say? Pamela's smile widened, a sick pleasure lighting up her face. You heard me. Nestor staggered back a step. His hands trembled. His head shook in disbelief. No. His voice was hoarse. Pamela only laughed. She was in the way, she murmured, so I moved her. Nestor's breathing turned ragged. And then, for the first time since I died, he broke. You killed her. Pamela's smile faltered. Nestor's entire body trembled. His hands clenched into fists. His breaths came in short, sharp gasps. His shoulders shook. He looked like a man who had lost everything. His voice cracked. You killed her. Pamela's fingers twitched. Nestor. You killed my wife. The words tore out of him like a wounded animal's cry. Pamela flinched. But then, in a desperate attempt to regain control, she reached for him. Nestor, you don't understand. His hands caught hers. But not gently. Not lovingly. His fingers wrapped around her wrists like iron chains. Pamela's eyes widened. And Nestor? For the first time, he looked at her like she was a stranger. His grip tightened. You planned it, he rasped. You murdered her. Pamela swallowed, her lips parting. Gee, her eyes darting toward the call button. But Nestor's grip tightened further, making her wince. He was shaking. Not with fear. But with something darker. A storm was brewing in his eyes, one Pamela had never seen before. You took everything from her, he whispered, his voice deadly calm. Pamela tried to pull her hands free. But Nestor's grip was unrelenting. And then, the door burst open. 2 police officers strode inside. Pamela's breath hitched. What's going on? She demanded. Dead, her voice rising in panic. The officers didn't answer her. One of them turned to Nestor. Mr. Joe, we received your report. Pamela's entire body went rigid. Her gaze snapped to Nestor in pure horror. He had called the police. Nestor's hands slowly loosened around her wrists. And for the first time, Pamela understood. She had lost. The end of Pamela. The police didn't give her time to react. They seized her arms, pulling her from the bed. Nestor, she shrieked, struggling against them. But he didn't move. He didn't look at her. He was done. I stood there, watching Pamela thrash and scream. And for the first time since my death, I smiled. Justice had finally arrived. But it wasn't over yet. Because Nestor still didn't know the full truth. And his punishment was still coming. Part 5, The Ghost of Regret. The aftermath of betrayal. Pamela's screams echoed through the sterile hospital hallways as the police restrained her, her arms locked behind her back. She thrashed, her face twisting with panic and fury. Nestor! You can't do this to me, she shrieked, kicking wildly. You love me. You always have. Nestor stood frozen, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. He watched her with an unreadable expression, one that was neither love nor pity, but something far colder. It was disgust. Pamela must have sensed it because her struggles became frantic. No. No, you don't understand, she wailed. She was in the way. I did it for us. For you. But Nestor remained silent, his gaze dark and detached. The officers yanked her forward. Nestor! Pamela screamed one last time before she was dragged from the room. And then? Silence. The only sound left was the slow, rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Nestor exhaled shakily, his hand running down. His face. I stood there, hovering unseen, watching him, waiting. Would he feel relieved now? Would he finally breathe easy, knowing Pamela was gone? I wanted to believe this was justice. But somehow, it wasn't enough. Because I was still here. Watching. Existing. Trapped in the invisible space between life and death. And that meant, it wasn't over yet. A truth that couldn't stay buried. Nestor sat on the edge of the hospital bed, his hands clasped tightly together. His breathing was uneven. His mind still reeling from everything. Pamela had killed me. She had plotted my death. She had stolen my heart. And yet, a part of him had let it happen. The thought struck him like a knife to the gut. Because deep down, he knew. He had treated me like I was disposable. Like I was nothing. Like my presence, my love, had never mattered. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for his phone. He opened our last conversation again. Let's get a divorce. His reply. Don't make trouble out of nothing. Gee. Nestor closed his eyes. He had dismissed me. Ignored me. Pushed me aside for Pamela, time and time again. And then, I was gone. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped his lips. Only now did he realize. He had never truly known me at all. Searching for a ghost. The next morning, Nestor wasted no time. He contacted the private investigator again. I need to know something, he said. The investigator sounded hesitant. What is it, sir? Nestor's grip on his phone tightened. I need to know where her body is. A long silence followed. Then, sir. The investigator's voice was careful, almost reluctant. There is no body. Nestor felt his entire body go numb. What do you mean? There was no burial. No cremation. No records of her being sent to a morgue. The investigator hesitated. It's like she vanished. Nestor's breath caught. That wasn't possible. No. People didn't just disappear. He clenched his fists. Then find out. I don't care how long it takes. The investigator hesitated again. But then agreed. And Nestor, who had spent so much of his life ignoring me, began searching for me. But he was too late. I was already gone. The weight of regret. Days passed. Pamela's trial was swift. The evidence was overwhelming, her texts, her deleted call logs, the testimony of the hired hitman. She was sentenced to life imprisonment. Her perfect world was over. But Nestor's wasn't any better. Because even though Pamela was locked away, I still haunted him. Not in the way ghosts should. I ever whispered his name in the dark. Never rattled doors or flickered lights. No. I haunted him in silence. In every quiet moment. In every time he looked at my empty side of the bed. In every night he checked his phone, waiting for a message that would never come. He buried himself in work. He stopped going home. He stopped sleeping. And then, one evening, he did something he had never done before. He went to my study. And there, among the dust-covered books and forgotten memories, he found something unexpected. A small, weathered photo album. The moment he opened it, his breath hitched. The first page held my student ID photo. My freshman year. A picture I had lost long ago. His fingers trembled as he traced the edges. And then, the dam broke. For the first time since my death. Nestor cried. Tears slipped down his face, landing on the pages. And in the silence of the empty house, his whispered words cut through the air like a confession to the dead. I loved you. I froze. What? Nestor exhaled shakily, gripping the album tighter. I loved you, he repeated, his voice raw. I was just too much of a coward to admit it. My ghostly form trembled. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I had spent my entire life chasing a love that never existed. I had given him my heart, literally. And now he dared to miss me? Now he dared to care? It was too late. Too late. The last goodbye. The next morning, Nestor did something unexpected. He bought a plot of land. And there, in the quietest corner of the cemetery, he built me a grave. It held no body. No ashes. Just a single small box, containing my lost photo and my broken necklace pendant. For weeks, he visited daily. Bringing fresh flowers. Sitting for hours, talking to the empty grave. Drinking in silence. Remembering. Regretting. And me? I just watched. Unseen. Unheard. Unforgiving. Until the day he finally broke. A love that died too late. The night was eerily quiet. A light drizzle coated the streets, making everything shimmer under the dim street lights. Nestor sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel. His phone lay beside him, a single message on the screen. Stop being stubborn. Come back when you're done causing trouble. The last words he had ever sent me. A bitter laugh escaped his lips. He was tired. Tired of working. Tired of drinking. Tired of the silence. He was tired of living. The red light ahead of him changed to green. But he didn't move. And then, a truck. A blinding flash of headlights. A screech of tires. A deafening crash. And everything went black. The final chapter. I felt it the moment he died. The invisible chains that had kept me tied to this world loosened. The heaviness in my chest disappeared. And for the first time I felt free. I looked down. At his lifeless body, the wreckage of his car twisted around him. And I whispered softly, so softly that only the dead could hear. See you in the next life. And then, I was gone. Forever. Part 6, The Rebirth of a Broken Soul. The end of everything. The world was silent. There was no sound of the wreckage. No voices. No cries. Just an overwhelming emptiness. Nestor's car lay crushed against the pavement, its twisted metal frame barely recognizable. The rain drizzled lightly, washing away the blood that had spilled onto the road. The streetlights flickered, casting a dim glow over the tragic scene. And me? I stood there, watching. Watching him. The man who had once been my husband. The man who had ignored my pain. The man who had loved me too late. His lifeless body was slumped over the steering wheel, his hand still loosely gripping his phone. The shattered screen displayed the last message he had ever sent me. Stop being stubborn. Come back when you're done causing trouble. A bitter wind passed through me. I should have felt something. Sadness. Anger. Regret. But there was nothing. No weight. No bitterness. Just the cold realization that it was finally over. A debt paid in blood. Nestor was gone. Pamela was rotting in prison. The people who had taken my life had finally received their punishment. I should have been satisfied. But something wasn't right. Because I was still here. Still lingering in this empty space, still tethered to a world that had already moved on without me. I turned away from the wreckage, staring at my own translucent form. Why? Why was I still here? What was I waiting for? And then, everything shifted. The rain stopped. The streetlights flickered one last time before plunging everything into darkness. And suddenly, I was falling. The moment everything changed. When I opened my eyes, the world was different. I wasn't Stan Ding on that rain-soaked street anymore. I wasn't floating in the endless void between life and death. I was somewhere else. I looked around, my breath catching. The walls were clean and white. The floor beneath me was polished. A familiar scent lingered in the air, one of fresh linens and expensive cologne. And then I heard it. A voice. A familiar voice. The drug is in. Hurry over. The room card is in the door gap. My entire body froze. No. No, this wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I turn. Ed my head slowly. I was standing inside a hotel restroom. A mirror reflected my wide, disbelieving eyes. I looked young. Not a ghost. Not a lifeless corpse. I was alive. And outside the restroom, lying unconscious on the bed, was Nestor. I had gone back in time. A second chance at life. I stood there, paralyzed, as the voices outside the room faded. I knew exactly what was happening. This was the night everything had begun. The night I was meant to fall into Nestor's life. The night I had unknowingly become his mistake. A chance meeting. A drunken accident. A misunderstanding that spiraled into a doomed marriage. This was the moment that had defined my entire existence. And I had been given a choice. The weight of the realization sent a shudder through me. This was my second chance. A way to rewrite everything. To make a different choice. To walk away. I turned to the door, my heart pounding. My fingers trembled as they wrapped around the handle. One step. Just one step and I could change my fate. I wouldn't have to endure years of pain. I wouldn't have to watch Nestor love another woman. I wouldn't have to die for him. I took a deep breath. And then, I left. I stepped out of the hotel room. And I never looked back. Letting go of the past. The night air was cool against my skin as I walked away from the hotel, my heart hammering in my chest. Every part of me expected something. To stop me. For fate to pull me back. For Nestor to wake up and call my name. for some unseen force to drag me back to my tragic ending. But nothing happened. The moment I stepped onto the street, I felt lighter. Freer. For the first time in both lifetimes, I had chosen myself. I had let go of the savior complex. I had stopped trying to save a man who had never needed me. I had walked away from a love that had only ever brought me pain. And as I disappeared into the quiet night, I whispered the last words I would ever say to him. Goodbye, Nestor. A future that was mine alone. Years passed. But this time, they were different. I didn't live in Nestor's shadow. I didn't chase after a love that would never be mine. I didn't waste my life fighting a battle I was destined to lose. I carved out a life for myself, one that was built on my own dreams, my own happiness. I studied harder. I traveled to places I had only ever dreamed of. I built a career, surrounded myself with people who truly cared about me. And I never looked back. I never searched for Nestor. I never wondered about Pamela. Because in this life, they didn't matter. In this life, I had saved myself. A love that was meant for me. Years later, on a quiet afternoon, I sat in a small cafe, sipping tea as I watched the city move around me. A man approached my table. He wasn't Nestor. He wasn't a ghost from my past. He was simply a kind stranger, with warm eyes and a gentle smile. Is this seat taken? He asked. I looked up at him, really looked. And for the first time, I felt nothing but peace. I smiled softly and gestured to the empty chair. No, I said. It's yours if you want it. And just like that, a new story began. A story where I was the main character. A story where love wasn't pain. A story where my heart belonged only to me.